And we are back on WGN-TV Political Report. So while officials are hopeful about life looking more normal in the coming months, there's no doubt the last year has tested us in ways we could never have imagined. Last week, Illinois marked 12 months since its first COVID-19 death and a year since Governor Pritzker's first stay-at-home order went into place. Political reporter Taman Bradley sat down with the governor to mark the losses of the pandemic and the long road still ahead of us.
Things were moving at a horrendously fast pace. I was worried very much about how fast would this spread, in what ways. We weren't being told. The federal government was offering us almost no guidance on this. And so what I was worried about was, are there things that I can do right now to keep people healthy? I didn't know what the numbers of deaths could be from this. Nobody knew, I don't think. But I knew that the more people I could keep healthy, the more likely it was I would keep people alive. And so this was really, a year ago today, was the beginning of one day after the next of making massive, important decisions that would have an impact on whether people would be alive.
So you were on alert before last March. You maybe had more information than the general public, but what was the moment for you when you realized, oh boy, this is different? Because just even thinking of my own experience, I think middle of March, I'm thinking, not sure what this is. I'm just going to go about my life like I usually do. What was the moment where you realized, boy, this is different?
Look, we knew it was different when we had to declare a disaster for the entire state on March 9th. So think about that. We knew there was something happening that was unusual, a virus causing us to have to issue a disaster declaration. But I would say with all the decisions that I had to make day by day, which included shutting down major gatherings, remember St. Patrick's Day last year, you know, thinking about schools, thinking about bars and restaurants, thinking about spreading locations. And then, very importantly, a day came when I received the first projections of how many deaths there might be in the state of Illinois if we didn't do something more significant. And that projection still sits to the left side of my desk, and I have not moved it for a year. And it showed that tens of thousands of people would die in Illinois if we didn't do something. I mean, many more than have actually died. And the projection was that those deaths, that we would likely see those deaths by August or September of 2020. And so when I looked at that, and these were projections that were done by, literally, by mathematicians, rocket scientists, no kidding, at Argonne, at Fermi, experts at University of Illinois, and ultimately I, looked at those numbers and said, it is time for us to move to a stay-at-home order.
Governor, wondering if you lost anyone close to you or any family to the virus?
I have. Two friends of mine have died of the virus. One that was a schoolmate of mine, a high school classmate, and it was very early on. So it was a very surprising thing to learn. And then a good friend of mine who was not only just a great human being, but a restaurant owner that people know in Evanston, named Hecky Powell. Just a wonderful human being who had turned his life around as a young man and had become a pillar of the Evanston community, and just a very kind human being. And I've personally been affected by it, and maybe just as importantly, I think every day about the people who are getting sick, about the people who are going into the hospital, the ICU, ventilators. Every day I look at these numbers a couple of times a day to think about what more can I do to keep people safe and healthy.
Yeah, we've all been impacted. I wanted to ask you, sir, about the United Center. There are reports your administration sent emails to city officials demanding that the vaccine eligibility at the site expand. If the goal at the UC site all along was equity, Why allow people from the suburbs to book appointments on the west side of Chicago?
That wasn't the expansion that we're talking about. What we were looking at is making sure that people who are vulnerable to the virus, people who have cancer, people who have diabetes, people who are in what's called phase 1B plus would be allowed to get vaccinated at the United Center. That's really what our primary focus was, to make sure that not just people of color, but also remember those vulnerabilities mostly affect those communities of color. And so we wanted to make sure that we were including everybody that would be eligible under 1B+. FEMA came in with their view of how this should be organized, and we went along with that. Again, in 1B+, because that's where most places in the country have moved to. But the city of Chicago was reluctant to do that. The Cook County was reluctant to move to 1B+. FEMA wanted it at 1B+ and wanted the site to be open to people all across the state. They changed their minds a few days later, and as a result, all of the rules for who could get an appointment changed.
So are you and the mayor now on the same page about the UC?
I think we've always been on the same page. And what we want is for people to get vaccinated as quickly as possible, and particularly people of color. And so I think our whatever differences have ever existed here have really just been about what's feasible.
So looking ahead, some of the COVID restrictions have loosened, some have not. Even Senator Sarah Feigenholtz says she's worried about losing tourists to other states. Wondering if you share that concern, and do you think we'll reach a point this summer where everything will be open and people can just kind of decide the risk, decide whether or not they want to take part in normal society again?
Look, I want to make sure that we keep businesses open and running and that we attract tourists to the state and so on. But remember, every time people have pushed for this sort of thing, we've had another surge. And so, my job and my North Star is people staying alive and staying healthy. And so as we've moved our numbers down in the state, and I think as people have followed the mitigations that we set in place, we've done much better in Illinois. And that's why we've opened things up gradually more and more and more. I know there are people who would like to move much faster. There are people who would like to just do what they did in Oklahoma or in Texas, take the masks off, do everything. The fact is that I want to make sure that all Illinoisans get through this pandemic alive, that we do everything we can to get them vaccinated. And the best thing for people to do is to keep their mask on, to get vaccinated, and make sure that we can get to the other side of this.
Governor, people's lives are so different now. Many students still haven't returned to in-person learning. Crime has been stubborn for many communities. The way we consume goods and services has changed. What's the recovery plan? Do you think that the state needs to develop a plan to help address the ways that people's lives have been turned upside down?
Well, as you know, all along we have been working off of a plan, and we've evolved that plan. We set the Restore Illinois plan starting really early before the summer. And then we worked through the plan. As you saw, we had surges and, challenges that we had along the way. So we had to make sure that on a regional basis, we're keeping people healthy, where some other regions were doing better. And so we continue to adjust those plans even now. Very important to me, of course, is to, as we move gradually toward normalcy, that we're gradually moving to open things up more. Again, with the thought in mind always, how do we make sure people are healthy while we're doing that?
But the violence obviously has increased in the city of Chicago, other cities across the state. We've even had police suicides. Wondering if you think there's a need for a state program that would mandate mental health screening annually for officers to assist them with the stress that they're under.
Well, as you know, I signed the SAFETY Act, which does include mental health services for law enforcement. I do believe that that's an extraordinarily important component. But you're also talking about just violence more broadly, and that's something that we've put an awful lot of dollars into programs that would meet people on the street to help them overcome the challenges that they have that lead them into a life of violence. I think it's also very important for each city like the city of Chicago, to have its law enforcement doing everything that they can to meet people where they live, to do the kind of proper enforcement that I think is necessary to keep violence to a minimum.
Illinois has been borrowing money. You wanted to graduate income tax to shore up state finances. That's not going to happen. Do you have a new long-term fix for our fiscal woes?
Well, as you saw, we put forward a balanced budget this year by making sure that we closed corporate welfare, corporate loopholes, and made cuts to state government. This isn't the kind of budget that I would have wanted to present, but it is the budget that will get us balanced and to make sure that we're still funding the things that are most important in the state.
But long term, the pension debt, for example.
Yeah, we've got to deal with all the challenges that face our state from a fiscal perspective. As you know, from the moment I took office, I put forward a number of ideas, some of which have already been adopted, that will begin to bring our pension payments down. I expanded the early buyouts that are available to people who retire from the pension system and other programs like that. And on top of that, what I've looked to do is to increase the number of businesses in the state of Illinois. I think more people paying taxes, more businesses in the state of Illinois who are attracted to the state, I think helps us to pay our bills.